I was wondering, we were talking about brand new instruments, kind of maybe a forced segue here on my part, but we were talking about instrument reproductions. So like a brand new old instrument, you do some reproducing, correct? And I'm just wondering how you got into instrument reproduction. And maybe you saying you reproduced instruments for yourself before you were able to get them, to
Yeah.
restore like that circular cornet. But is that maybe how you got into
Well,
reproducing?
no, that was a singular case.
Okay, gotcha.
Um, Actually, going back to Bartold music again, he had he had a number of Civil War era instruments, and this would have been the late '70s. And he told me, he said, these things are becoming valuable. You should start making these. And his idea was to take like a modern piston valve trumpet and make the bell point over your shoulder and then sell that to these Civil War bands who were desperate for over the shoulder instruments.
Yeah.
And that never appealed to me at all. I never made anything like that while I was at Bartold Music. but it wasn't long after that, after I started my own shop in '79. '79 is also the year that Effie Olds went out of business and they auctioned off everything that was left in the factory. So there were just thousands of new old stock Olds parts floating around Southern California back then. And I was broke at the time of the auction, so I couldn't bid on any of the lots that were being sold. But I later bought things from people that did buy. They would have these big roller bins full of parts, and you had to bid on like 2 or 3 of these bins full of parts.
Yeah.
I don't remember what they went for, but so these guys would buy these bins and, figuring, well, I'll scrap some of it. I'll try to use some of it and the rest I'll sell off. So I bought parts from guys that had bought these bins full of Olds parts. And that included a lot of rotary valves and a few bells and things and crooks, things that I would need. And so I think by about 80 or 81, I thought, well, I can make a new over-the-shoulder cornet now. So with the Olds French horn rotary valves and an Olds bell, I built the first replica that I ever made. And it was all brand new parts. It wasn't just hacked up old horns.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So did you, for that first cornet example, did you just use those parts and make it into the shape of what you kind of recognize it as being, or were you actually using those parts and referring back to a design of maybe an instrument collection or a schematic or something?
Yeah, it's funny how memory is from your when you're in your 20s, because I do remember really well. I was working out of just a garage in a rented house, a house that I rented, and I didn't have access to original over-the-shoulder instruments, so I was looking for pictures in books and things. And I remember the picture that I had was it was an ad in the back of the American Musical Instruments Society journal of an E-flat cornet. I thought, oh, here we go. Here's a real nice picture, real good photograph. This is how I'm going to make it. And it wasn't even an American-made instrument; it was an import, but that didn't really matter. It was the right shape.
Yeah.
So yeah, it just based on a photograph, basically, and what the few originals I had seen by then.
Yeah. And I know we talked to like Randy Cable, and we've talked to a number of other people that have purchased and extensively used your instruments. After that first over the shoulder instrument that you made, did you eventually kind of create your own design, or were you copying other specific instruments, as you got more into it, or how did that work?
Yeah, well, it was always an evolving thing. I always wanted to make them as accurate to the originals as possible. But like I mentioned earlier, it's always a balancing act. I have to be able to make this to a price that I can sell it to somebody. I'm not going to make instruments that I'm just going to pile up in the shop and go broke, and then they auction them off.
True. Yeah.
So yeah, using as many mass-produced parts as I can, and even the earliest over-the-shoulders, large horns that I made, I would use like the large branches from. I'm trying to remember now. It's just so many years ago, but like some of the branches from marching baritone horns or something, I would use for the bottom branch of a over-the-shoulder bass. That kind of thing.
Yeah,
And acoustically, it worked okay. It was not necessarily ideal, and I realized that at the time. But I mean, my instruments were cheap. I think the first over-the-shoulder tuba I made would have been about 1984, I think, 83. I probably sold it for $1,200. It was a lot of work. Anyway, but I realized that as good as they were, it wasn't ideal. So eventually I started making all those branches myself. It was a lot of work, but I could make them dimensionally correct. So they were better instruments.
Yeah.
I never made any of the large bells. The only bells that I'm able to make in my shop are the soprano bells and the key bugle bells. That's pretty much it.
So with the smaller instruments that you are folding and forming metal for, are you making like copies of specific instruments then with the instruments that you are doing custom metal work for? Or are they still kind of like your own like Frankenstein design?
Oh man, that's not a good way of putting it. But I mean, there's a lot of truth to it. Again, as time went on, I tried to make them more and more accurate, and I got to the point where all the E flat and B flat cornets were pretty good, pretty close to originals.
Mm-hmm.
I made a copy of the E.G. Wright soprano bell, so because there's no modern equivalent that's really that close to that. So that was one I decided to make myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I eventually had rotary valves made to the right bore sizes, so that
Gotcha.
like the E flat soprano shouldn't have a 468 bore. It should have something around 435.
Gotcha.
So the larger instruments I always used modern bells that were as close as I could come.
Yeah. If you had an E flat bass with something that required as long of a bell as that, what type of bell?
Well, if you look at the pictures on my website, it would be like a normal tuba bell, and then connected to a branch. The bell wouldn't be the full length of the instrument.
Gotcha.
And the last half a dozen or so that I made always had a removable bell. Partly as I got older, I realized this is really stupid to have to hold this long tuba in front of the buffing machine all day long, because it takes like a full day to polish one of those things.
Yikes.
And so I made the bells removable, and there are a few examples of original over-the-shoulder instruments where the bell is original, so that is somewhat authentic.
Mm-hmm.
Even one of the Graves, there's a Graves over-the-shoulder bass, B-flat bass, euphonium size instrument.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really wonderful instrument, and well preserved too. That the bell unscrews right at that point where I was making them unscrew. And so I can say it's authentic.
Yeah, of course.
I've seen Fisk that way. I've seen a few others.